In this video, we're going to be looking at Paper 1, Section B, Conflict and Tension, 1918 to 39, Peacemaking, which is the first of 3 topics for this section. Okay, so to start with, a little bit of background. So, 20 million people had died fighting or being caught up in the First World War. And this had lasted from 1914 to 1918. An area in France the size of Wales had been destroyed. And then in November 1918, the Germans asked for an armistice, which is essentially a ceasefire, an ending of the fight. The Germans knew they could fight no more. And expected that they would be given a fair peace, seeing as they were the ones who'd asked for the armistice. They therefore thought that they had not surrendered to the Allies, which included the USA, Britain and France, also known as the Big Three. And then in January 1919, 32 countries met at a place called Versailles, which is on the outskirts of Paris, and they were going to discuss how the war would end and what would happen to countries that had lost, such as Germany. This conference was known as the Paris Peace Conference, and it would last until June 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles would be signed. Now, unlike other treaties in history, Versailles was not negotiated between the Germans and the Allies. In fact, the Germans had no say in what was going to happen in this treaty. Only the Allies were invited to the conference, as they believed they had won the war. They imposed the terms upon Germany, and this was called a Diktat, or a dictated peace. Right, so let's look at the aims of the Big Three. Now, the Big Three were Britain, France, and the USA. And the 3 most important men at the Versailles Conference, who we also know as the Big Three, were, for Britain, David Lloyd George. For France, we had George Clemenceau. And for the USA, the president was Woodrow Wilson. All 3 men were very much agreed that they wanted to stop a war ever happening again, but they did not agree about how to do this. They all wanted different things from the peace, and they did not get on very well at all. So, Clemenceau, he wanted revenge, pure and simple. And he wanted to punish the Germans for what they had done to his country, i.e. 2 million. So Clemenceau, he wanted revenge, pure and simple. And he wanted to punish Germany for what had happened to France during the First World War, i.e. the number of deaths that had taken place. Over 1.5 million French were dead, plus an area, as we've said, an area the size of Wales had been destroyed due to the fighting. He wanted to make Germany pay for the damage that had been caused, and this is called reparations. And the number of reparations he wanted was around £10 billion. He also wanted to weaken Germany, and to do this, he wanted to completely disarm the country so that Germany would not have an armed force whatsoever. He also wanted to break up Germany into 22 different states. The whole idea behind this was, though, that Germany would now be so weak that it would never be able to recover and invade France again. David Lloyd George, in public, was very much of the same mind. He said he wanted to make Germany pay. And many in Britain were very, very happy to hear such things like that. Lloyd George wanted justice, not revenge. He said that the peace must not be harsh. That would just cause another war in several years' time. He tried to get a halfway point between what the French wanted and what the Americans wanted, which we'll look at in a second. He wanted a compromise, is the word. He also wanted to expand the British Empire. And he wanted to do that by taking Germany's overseas colonies in Africa and also increase Britain's trade. Finally, he wanted to reduce Germany's armed forces and he wanted to take the German Navy for his own. And finally, Woodrow Wilson wanted to make the world safe and a better place, avoiding all wars in the future. He wanted to end war by making a fair peace. In 1918, Wilson published his 14 points, saying about what he really wanted. He said he wanted disarmament of all countries, not just Germany. He said he wanted a League of Nations, a sort of world parliament that instead of fighting to solve problems, countries would go to talk about their issues and resolve them peacefully. He also wanted self-determination for countries of Eastern Europe. Effectively, that means that the people living there in Eastern Europe who had been ruled by the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, would now be able to choose who would rule them in their own country, effectively giving them the right to rule themselves. On the 28th of June 1919, the victors met at the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles near Paris and forced Germany to agree to the terms of peace. And remember, we call that a diktat, a dictated peace. Germany was not allowed to send any delegates and had no choice but to accept whatever was decided. The first 26 articles of the treaty set out the covenant of the League of Nations, which was going to be set up, again, as Wilson had wanted, where countries would meet to discuss their problems in order to avoid the war. The rest of the 440 articles dealt with Germany's punishment. Now, a really easy way of remembering the terms of the Treaty of Versailles is to remember BRAT, or BRAT. So the B stands for blame. Germany had to accept the blame for starting the war, and we know that as Clause 231. Reparations. Germany had to pay a staggering £6.6 billion in reparations for the damage caused during the war. A stands for armed forces. Germany's armed forces were drastically reduced. They were forbidden of having any submarines, tanks, or planes. They were allowed 6 battleships. The rest were given to Britain. And they were allowed an army of just 100,000 men. In addition, Germany was not allowed to place any troops in the area of the border with France known as the Rhineland. And the final term we're going to look at is T, which is territory. Germany lost territory in Europe, such as Alsace-Lorraine, which was given back to France. It lost Western Prussia to Poland. And Germany's overseas colonies in Africa were given to Britain and France to control. Finally, the Germans were not allowed to join the League of Nations until they'd proven that they were a peaceful country, and they were no longer allowed to unite with Austria. And we call that Anschluss. So let's look now at how the Germans reacted to the Treaty of Versailles. When Germans heard about the Treaty of Versailles, they said they felt pain and anger. Essentially, they said the treaty was unfair. At first, they refused to sign the treaty, and some Germans even wanted the war to start again. They were angry with Clause 231, the War Guild Clause. They said they were not to blame for the war, and that each country should take joint responsibility for what had happened. The soldier who was actually sent to sign the treaty initially refused to sign it, saying to sign such a thing would be a lie. They were also angry about the reparations. They said Britain and France were trying to starve their children to death. At first they refused to pay, and only did so after France and Britain threatened to invade Germany in January of 1921. They were also angry about their armed forces being reduced. The Germans were very proud of their armed forces and felt humiliated by the fact that their armed forces were now reduced by such numbers. They said it left them weak and defenceless, vulnerable against attack from other countries, such as France. At first, they did refuse to reduce their army, and the sailors actually sank their fleet rather than hand it over. The Germans also thought the loss of territory was unfair. Germany had lost 1/10 of its overall land. Other nations, such as Poland and Czechoslovakia, had been given self-determination, but this had been denied for Germans. Around 10% of Germans now lived in new countries that had been created by the Treaty of Versailles, and they were not allowed self-determination. They had no right to choose who ruled them. Germans also felt it was unfair that they were not allowed to now unite with Austrian Germans. So how satisfied were the big three with the final Treaty of Versailles? It is often claimed that the Treaty of Versailles was a failure, and many historians say that the treaty not only angered the Germans, it didn't even satisfy the big three. In the end, all three men had to compromise on their aims. Each of them had something in the treaty that they liked, but also they had a lot of things they didn't like. So let's start with Wilson. Things he did like. He did have the League of Nations set up, although the Americans were not allowed to join in the end. And he did get self-determination for the peoples of Eastern Europe. So new countries were set up, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. However, he didn't like that the Germans had no self-determination in some areas and had been denied this by the treaty. He also did not like the reparation payments. He thought that was far too much for Germany to pay. He didn't like that many of his 14 points had been ignored. And when he got back to the US, the Senate even refused to allow the Americans to join the League of Nations, which had been his idea, and also even refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, let's look at Clemenceau. So he was happy with the reparations payments. He thought that it was enough to repair the damage to France. He was happy with the tiny German army, which would hopefully stop the Germans from ever being able to attack the French again. He was happy that the Rhineland was demilitarized, and that again would protect France in the future. And finally, France got Alsace-Lorraine back, which they had lost to Germany in 1870. They also got some German colonies in Africa. However, he too was disappointed with the treaty. For example, it was not harsh enough. He wanted more reparations, and he wanted Germany to be split up into 22 different states, which didn't happen. And then finally, Lloyd George. Many British people wanted to make Germany pay, and Lloyd George liked the fact that we got some of German colonies in Africa, which expanded the British Empire. And the small German navy would help expand the British navy and help to continue to rule the waves. But Lloyd George hated the treaty. He thought it was far too harsh and would ruin Germany. He had wanted to continue trading with Germany after the war, as Germany had been Britain's second largest trading partner after the USA. He thought the war would start up again in 25 years' time, due to Germany wanting to get revenge. So lastly, let's look at some verdicts of the Treaty of Versailles. There have been many different verdicts on the Treaty of Versailles. Harold Nicolson, a British delegate at Versailles, declared the treaties neither just nor wise, and called the Big Three very stupid men. However, Winston Churchill believed that the treaty was the best that could be achieved, and that the wishes of the various populations prevailed. Obviously, the Germans hated the treaty. They felt it was unfair, and they themselves wanted to seek revenge in later years to right the wrongs of 1919. It helped contribute to the rise of Adolf Hitler when he said that he was going to destroy the Treaty of Versailles in the 1930s. And many of the steps that he took in the 1930s were all aimed at righting the wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles and reclaiming lost territory and increasing the size of Germany's military. But also, none of the Big Three were completely satisfied. As we said, Woodrow Wilson was very disappointed in the treaty. Although he got some things that he did like, such as the League of Nations being set up, many of his 14 points were ignored, and he himself was not allowed to join. Likewise, the Americans didn't even sign the treaty in the end. The French, Clemenceau, he didn't think the treaty was harsh enough, and in fact, neither did his people. He was voted out of power for not punishing the Germans harsh enough in the later years. And Lloyd George, he believed that the treaty was stupid, and he himself thought that another war would start within 25 years, and he wasn't far off. Others do make the point though, however, that it was actually a compromise peace. And the fact that the Big Three could agree on anything in the time they had while Europe was collapsing around them was actually a miracle. That's the end of this video. The next video we'll be looking at the League of Nations.